So this is a video on as faff-free as possible sourdough bread. Now we've made the sourdough starter. If you've seen the video on the sourdough starter, this is the bowl that I made the starter in. You can watch videos on making sourdough and it seems quite ridiculous, the amount of care, time and effort that you need to put into it. You don't need to put as much effort in as some of these videos show you. You do if you want that really crispy loaf with that nice split down the center. You really kind of have to follow those videos to get that, but we can make a really good quality sourdough bread which tastes absolutely wonderful and has those nice big air pockets in it, and quite a minimum amount of fuss. And this is kind of quite an easy way to do it. I always think if it's baby steps with cooking. So if to try and make one of those artisan loaves straight away, unless you're very talented and very observant, then you're not going to get that in the first crack. And it can be kind of a little bit off-putting if you can't do it straight away. However, if you can just make a loaf that tastes good, looks good, and it's relatively easy, then you can move yourself on to making something a little bit more complicated. So this is quite a simple, well, as simple as I can make it, although I have got a habit of faffing around too much. So this is it. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to take some of our starter and we need to activate it and do the first stage. I've made my starter with plain flour, so you can criticize that if you like. However, when we're making a 500-gram loaf, there's only going to be a tablespoon's worth of a dessert spoon's full of plain flour in with the rest of the strong flour. So it's not going to make that much difference in my eyes. So that's all the starter from our culture that we actually need to get the bread going. We need to use a good quality bread flour. I like not particularly bothered about a brand, however I do like the very strong white flour. There is strong white flour, but this is very strong and it just happens to make a better loaf. I will make a video with making cheap supermarket strong flour, but you just need to make it in a different way. So I can't remember the recipe now. Right, so we need to activate the starter, we need to pour in 150 grams of flour and 150 grams worth of water, and then unfortunately we have a little bit of waiting to do. So you can need to be a little bit exact with this. So that's 150 grams and then 150 grams of water. And then we need to leave this out until it starts to really be kind of active. And I'll show you what it looks like after it's been active. But it might take 6 hours, it might take 12 hours, it might take 24 hours, all depending on the ambient temperature of the room that you've got it in. So it's a little bit over with the water, so we just need a little bit more flour. And then we're going to give it a mix, and we're just going to leave it somewhere just to get active. So gentle with it, but there's enough yeast in that tiny amount of starter that we had already in the bowl to activate the rest of this flour. Down the way, give that a mix. If you're wanting to make, this makes one loaf. If you're wanting to make more than one loaf, if you haven't want to have a faff around with a few loaves in one day, then you need to activate more starter. But this will be enough for one loaf. So scrape off that, and leave it until it starts being a lot more active than it is. There's a little, you could You could take a tablespoon of starter and add it to some bread dough, and it would rise eventually. But you just need to get like a mini culture of yeast going. I'm not making much sense, but you need to get this going so you've got more yeast to make the bread rise. So that's it. Might take 6 hours, might take 12 hours, might take 24 hours, but we'll come back when it's ready and I'll show you what it looks like when it's ready to go. Part 2 of simple sourdough bread making. Well, as simple as it can be, because it's a little bit more complicated than normal bread, but I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. The starter has been out for 24 hours now, and it's starting to really bubble. It could be a little bit more bubbly than that, but that's fine for the moment. It just means that the yeast is really active and it's feeding, and there's plenty of yeast in there, so that means that the bread making process will be will be speeded up. So we will, this bit's I've forgotten what it's called, it's got a French name, but what we're going to do now is we're going to incorporate all the ingredients together, and then we're going to let it sit for an hour. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow the flour to completely absorb all the water, which you kind of think, well, obviously that should just fully absorb as soon as you've mixed it all in. But no, you really need to leave it for an hour, and then it completely saturates all the flour with the moisture. I know it sounds a little bit hokey, and I'm not sure I believed it the first time that I did it, but it works because I've done it where you just mix the bread and go straight into the knead, and I've done it this way where you leave it for an hour before you knead it, and this way works better. So 500 grams of strong white flour, which is the very strong flour, not just the strong white, the very strong white. And then we need 300 grams, well, we'll put some salt in first. I don't measure my salt, so I don't know, it's like a good pinch to me, so we'll weigh it today, so you kind of know how much to put in. And I'm using fine salt. I normally recommend using sea salt in things and rock salt in things, but I just worry that the crystals don't fully melt into the bread. Even with all the kneading and the proving, I just don't think it melts in properly, so I use fine salt. So it's a good pinch, so it is 2 grams, maybe a bit more. Yeah, 2 to 3 grams of salt. I'd say 2 actually. I've seen recipes that say 5 grams per 500 grams of salt, and I just find that far too salty. So it's a sourdough, so we don't need to worry too much about separating the yeast and the flour, but we'll just cover it over. And then we want 300 grams of the starter. There will be a little bit of the starter left in the bowl, but that's fine. It's only a bit of flour and water. So as you can see, as I'm pouring it in, there's lots of air bubbles there, just waiting to get to the surface. So 300 grams of this. Just kind of, that's way over. So we'll just take out some of that. A little bit more. It's very sticky. We'll just judge it the best we can. I think that'll be about 40 grams in that little bit there. Ooh, 5 more grams. Just a bit over. It'll be fine. So it's a little bit over, and then reset the scales, and then we want 275 grams of water. Sourdoughs are really wet dough. You don't have to use as much water. If you're a little bit concerned about using really wet dough and kneading it, I would recommend that you can use less. Anything from about 225 grams of water right the way up to 275. I've never done over 275. Maybe I will do one day, but I think 275 is a good number. But if you're concerned about wet doughs and you want to build up to a, oop, gone over. See, to be talking. I'll just scoop out some of that water. You can work, it's, now I've gone a bit more. You can work your way up to wetter doughs. A little bit more. There we go. That's a little bit over, that's fine. So, You can work your way up to wetter doughs, but anything from about maybe 200 grams of water right the way up to 275, and you'd probably be able to take it a little bit further, but I never have. So what we just do now is just slightly mix it all together, just roughly, just so everything's incorporated, and then we're going to leave it, and we're going to cover it for an hour, just to let everything completely get mixed in. I thought it was, when I first saw it, I thought it was a lot of rubbish, but it works. I don't know, I can't explain fully because I don't understand enough, but I just know that it works, and it's one of the key things that you really need to be doing. Although while I'm here and I'm just mixing things through, so sourdough's different to normal bread. I think it's a lot more forgiving. If you use dried or packet yeast or fresh yeast making normal bread, you're kind of regimented about what you're doing. If you start making a loaf of bread using normal yeast at 9 o'clock in the morning, that's it. That's all you're going to be doing for the next few hours. You know, it's a you need to mix it, you need to knead it, and then you need to rest it, and then knock it back, and then prove it again, and then put it in the oven. And it's kind of quite regimented. The yeast has only got a certain amount of life in it before it overproves bread and then dies. Whereas sourdough, it's a much more living dough. So I think it's a little bit more forgiving. And you can speed the process up a little bit, but you can also slow the process down. So I have in the past got to this stage, and then I've left it for 2 hours, and then come back and kneaded it later. And at certain stages of the proving, you can put it in the fridge or put it somewhere cooler, and it slows down the proving process. So, and the bread's fine. You can't do that with normal bread. You have to. The yeast in normal bread dictates how you have to treat it. So that's mixed in well enough for the moment, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover it, and then we'll leave it for an hour. It is going to be an hour today, because I'm not doing anything else this morning. Well, I've got things to do, but you know, I'm going to make the bread. So I will show you what I'm going to use to cover it as well, which is important. So I'm very aware of plastic waste, so I don't like using cling film and bags and those type of things when I can. So this is one of those cheap shower caps that old ladies use in the shower, and that's what I use to cover my bread when it's proving. I've had this one over a year, and I just kind of think the amount of bread that I make and the amount of cling film or bags or things that I would have used to cover my bread in that time would have been quite a lot of plastic, whereas I've just used this once, you know, and I reuse it and reuse it and reuse it and reuse it and use it, and I just think that's a really good way of cutting down on the plastic. And also, if I ever needed to have a shower and keep my hair dry, I'd have these in the house as well. So anyway, that's it. That's for an hour. We'll let it just completely, all the liquid soak into the flour, and then we'll come back and we'll knead it. So, hour later, and the dough will have soaked in all that moisture, so it'll be easier to knead. I was contemplating whether or not I should actually show you kneading for 10 minutes, and then I kind of just thought, oh well, I'll just put a timestamp in the description of the video, and then you can just skip through it if you don't want to see 10 minutes of kneading. But if you're interested, what you'll see as you knead it, the texture and consistency of the bread will change over the 10 minutes. So if you're interested, you can see that. But otherwise, my technique's not brilliant, but it's more about just activating the gluten in the bread flour. What was I going to say? Right, so yeah, if you're going to make bread on a regular basis, you just need to be careful what you're going to knead it on, because even though you won't think so, bread and things like pastry over time will scratch the surface. So if you've got shiny worktops, over time your bread will dull them, because it's a mild abrasive. So what I use is a cheap, well, it was cheap at the time. It's a chopping block, I bought it from IKEA, and it was cheap, and I was just kind of one of those whimsical buys. I was like, oh, I'll just buy one of those, and never used it for anything in the kitchen because it's rather heavy, but for kneading bread, it's perfect. And because I'm going to be pushing that way, what I do is I rest it up against the wall, which is there, and then it doesn't, and then the board doesn't move. If you're not bothered about your worktop, if your work surface is dulling over time, that's fine. But I always do it on a board. What else did I have to add? No, I think that's it. Oh yeah. So there's lots of different recipes, lots of different ways of kneading. I've seen people where they just knead and they kind of like throw the dough down, and then they do that for a couple of minutes, and then they leave it for 20 minutes, and then come back and repeat the process, and then repeat the process. If I'm honest, if bread's a bit messy, and that means if I was doing that method, I have to wash my hands 3 separate times, and then I'm stuck doing kneading for like an hour. And if I'm not doing anything else, it's to get myself messy again with bread dough, and then start kneading again after 10 minutes. It's fine if you work in a professional bakery and you've got other things to do and other loaves to knead, that's fine. But I just kind of think 10 minutes solid kneading, and then it's done. So we need to set the timer on the cooker for 10 minutes, and we'll start kneading. So onto the board, and then it's just a case of pushing the dough like that. And that is all the skill that I involve with kneading. I can't remember how they taught us at college, but my bread turns out really well. So that's kind of, this is the method I use. But now we have got 10 minutes of me huffing and puffing, making noises while I knead bread. So it's a kind of a push motion, and then a pull back, and then push, and a pull back, and a push, and a pull back, and a push, and a pull back, and a push, and a pull back. And it's a really sticky dough, a lot stickier than normal bread. So it's a little bit more difficult to use. But you know, your hands get a little bit messy, but that's fine. What you can do to get all this stuff that gets caked to your hands, there will be more of it. All I simply do is I just rub my hands with some flour, and then that gets rid of all that. So 10 minutes of kneading and me saying random things. I normally listen to a podcast when I'm kneading bread, but not today. There you go. See, it's already started to change its texture. We'll scrape up these bits as we go and add them back into the dough. This stage is just about activating the gluten, so you get a nice structure to the bread, and you can get some nice big air pockets. And it also makes things that make sure that everything's fully incorporated together. So the salt's nice and evenly distributed, and the starter's nice and evenly distributed. I've never been able to. I've got a dough hook attachment on my mixing machine, but I've never been satisfied with the way it needs it. I don't know if it's just a not particularly a good design, or not particularly a good mixer, or I'm not using. It's quite a big bowl, or if I'm not mixing enough dough in it. In one go, if I'm just doing like a 500 gram batch, it might need a kilo batch, but it just never seems to do the job that I want it to do. So by hand, it's a little bit of exercise, it's not much. Can't imagine I'm burning very many calories. Certainly not enough calories to warrant the amount of butter that I have on my bread, or lard if I'm frying it. So you can see it's changing consistency. It's got a little bit stickier, and what we'll find is that over these next 10 minutes it'll become less sticky. It's really starting to stick into the board now, but that's fine. So it's like a push and a roll. So like a push and then a pull back, and a push and pull back. I've seen videos when they talk about the gluten structure, and you want long gluten strands in the bread, and I found that quite I can't wrap my head around it, if I'm honest. I don't understand enough about it, because I think it's a wet dough, so it kind of melts back into itself. So the forming of the dough, I don't kind of quite understand. And I think a lot of people make bread they're not master bakers, so they don't fully understand why you do things, so they just do them rather than understanding, so they can't explain fully why they do things. I don't know any master bakers to kind of fully explain why they do certain things, and you have to do certain things, which also makes me question things and see if I can do things in a different way if you have to do things in a certain way. But anyway, so texture of bread's changing, as you can see, slowly. Any master bakers on here can fully rip my technique to bits. I'm not really bothered. I just need something to... So, we'll just scrape that off. Incorporate that back into the dough. I mean, it's a really wet dough to work with. So, if you're using like a not particularly good quality bread flour, or a stronger one as this, I'd advise you to use less water. It's the protein and the gluten in this extra strong flour that keeps it all together. So you can add, my nose is running a little bit, keep having to wipe it on my arm. It's the extra strong flour that means you can add more water to this dough. So if you're using cheaper flours, or you can't get hold of stronger bread flours, I'd just use a little bit less water. Oh yeah, and we'll talk about wholemeal flour while we're here. So if you want to make wholemeal bread, it's a different thing as wholemeal bread and whole grain bread, because it's not. This is 100% flour that I'm using, whereas if you're using whole grains, it's not. It's flour and other things. So if you have a recipe and you're using 500 grams of flour, it's not 100% flour. It will be 450 grams of flour and then 50 grams of fibrous material. So you kind of need to change the amount of water that you put in it, if that makes sense, because you're not. The fibrous material, like the whole grains in the flour, won't act the same way as a 100% white flour. I'm trying to make that makes sense in my head. I'm not sure how I said it makes fully sense. Right, so you can see it's getting a lot better now. And what we're in 5 minutes ish. So yeah, so wholemeal bread's a different kettle of fish. I'll do a wholemeal. I'll do a cheap flour bread recipe, and I'll do a wholemeal at some time in the future, and I'll explain what I mean about flour and how you kind of have to use more of the wholemeal bread flour to compensate for the fact that it's not all 100% flour, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? I don't know. But anyway. I mean, to start, if you haven't kneaded bread before for 10 minutes, this is going to completely tire you out, because your muscles aren't used to doing it. So you just need to build yourself up to it. I mean, like, do 5 minutes of kneading, and then have a little bit of break and do another 5 minutes of kneading. You don't have to do it all in one go. It's just a case of there's a certain amount of work that needs to go into the dough to make it as elastic as you want it. So, and it doesn't really matter if it takes you 20 minutes and have a few breaks in between, or 10 minutes of straight kneading, as long as you've got to put that work in. And the same if you're using a mixer, that work needs to be put into the dough to get it elastic enough that it's going to work properly. There are lots of fancy moulding techniques that I've seen people do when they're making sourdough. Those are the videos to watch. Fancy foaming techniques. Forming techniques, not foaming. This isn't that video. This is just about getting the best results that you can for a minimum amount of work. Right, so we're coming up to the end of the 10 minutes of kneading, and we'll talk about, there we go, that's it, 10 minutes of kneading. That went fast, didn't it? So that's that. Still nice and sticky. It's going to make a nice dough, is that? So whereas now with a normal bread mix, it'll rise in 2 hours and then be ready to be knocked back if you've made bread before. So a normal bread mix, you leave it for a couple of hours now covered. It would double in size. You'd knock it back. You'd give it a bit of another knead, form it into the shapes you want, let it rise again, and then you'd bake it. Sourdough's not like that. Sourdough takes its time, and also because it takes its time, it develops flavour. Hence sour dough. That's why it tastes a little bit sour. So this next proving, this first bit of proving might take 4 hours, it might take 10 hours, it might take 12 hours. It's just how it is. It kind of depends on ambient temperature in the room. I can't get into that because it's just a little bit too ridiculous for me to kind of start timing how long bread takes to prove in certain temperatures. I don't want to have to do that. But it's ready when it's ready. So it might be 4 hours, it might be 8 hours, it might be 10 hours. On the plus side of that, it's quite forgiving. So if you overprove at this stage that we're doing now, it doesn't particularly matter, because there's so much life. There's so much life in the dough, and there's so much food in there that it carries on fermenting and proving. So if you overprove it at this stage, it doesn't matter. It will still form. It will still make a good bread. With ordinary bread, with ordinary yeast, if you overprove things, they tend to collapse once you start cooking them, because a normal yeast has only got so much life in it. It's got a life expectancy of say, let's say 2 hours. Then after those 2 hours, it starts to die. A sourdough doesn't do that. A sourdough carries on living. I don't know why. I think it's due to when you're making normal bread. It's like a sourdough will carry on eating the flour in the dough. A normal yeast doesn't do that. A normal yeast kind of like has so much life in it, and then it dies. A sourdough will, as long as there's food in that dough for the starter, for the yeast to eat, it will carry on eating it, and it will carry on fermenting. And what you want to do is you want to kind of optimize. Did I say that right? But you want to optimize. There we go. Optimize a balance of flavour, which is going to develop over time with the bread, and how long the yeast has got enough food for it to carry on eating. So it will get to the stage where it's not overproved, because it's still fermenting, but it becomes too sour and not a very nice thing to eat. Whereas what we want to do is we want to kind of balance that, get it to a nice flavour without it being too sour and going too far. So this might take 4 hours, this might take 8 hours, this might take 10 hours to prove, but I'll show you what it's like when it's doubled in size, and then we'll talk about the next stage. But we just have to keep an eye on it. I'm going to go out for a walk for a few hours, and I'm quite happy to leave that for 3 hours while I go out for a walk, and nothing will come bad of it whatsoever. So it's not going to rule, the bread's not going to rule my day. I'm going to make sure that the bread fits in with what I want to do. If you want to slow down the proving process, you can put it in a cooler room, or you can keep it in the fridge. And it'll still prove over time, but in a warmer environment, it's going to prove a little bit quicker. But you don't want to prove too quick, because you want those flavours to develop in the dough to make it nice and sour. But anyway, that's it for now. So we'll come over using that. and we'll let prove until it's doubled in size. So 12 hours later, and it's finally doubled in size. Doesn't normally take this long, but then it is. We are in the middle of winter, and it's kind of quite cold at the moment, and the ambient temperature in the house is kind of quite cold. Even though I put it in a warmish place, it's just taken a while, and it's just sometimes that it does. It is, and it's its own person, is a sourdough loaf, if I'm honest, and it can be a little bit temperamental. However, we can tell that it's doubled in size. Difficult to kind of judge it when you first start making dough, because it wants to spread out, and you don't kind of know if it has actually doubled in size. There are a few bubbles that that are wanting to push through to the surface, but also we'll turn the dough over and we can see on the bottom that there's some nice big air pockets, which means that it has really started to want to rise. So we can see there, where that dough wanting to fall out, you can see all those pop marks on the bottom. That is all the dough wanting to double in size. Also, we're going to knock it back in a second and pour it into a proving bowl for the second prove stroke fermenting, and you'll see that it will shrink back to like a handful of dough. So that's kind of 2 handfuls of dough, and it's about a handful of dough. But we'll talk about the proving baskets. You can buy them; they're expensive. However, we are all about not cutting corners, but making things a little bit cheaper. So this is a normal bowl, and I put in a flat cotton. It was an old napkin, like a posh cloth napkin that I had. It's flat cotton, and so it's a good thing. It doesn't want to be anything bobbly. Like so, if you imagine a tea towel like that, it's kind of quite bobbly. As the dough is very sticky, it's going to stick to anything that is bobbly. So it's flat cotton. An old tea towel will be fine, as long as it's clean. And then on the bowl, so it's on a bowl like that. So it's the same type of bowl that I proved the bread in. And what I've done is just tie a bit of string around the lip of the bowl. Put the cloth over the bowl like that. And then tie the string around, and then turn it over, and create a dip in the bowl there, and that will serve as a purpose for a proving basket for this second prove. By all means, buy yourself a proving basket. They're about, I looked into it, and they're about 16, 17 pounds. I don't know what is that is addressable, but I thought that was a little bit too expensive. And if you just want to get into something and just do it a few times, and then you find out that it's not for you, you haven't had that big outlay of money. So we're going to put, because it's a sticky dough, we're going to put lots of flour on top of the onto the cloth, and then I'll stop it from sticking, and also it'll also make it kind of like a nice crust on top of the bread as well. So plain flour. There's no point wasting your good quality sourdough. Not sourdough. No point wasting your excellent quality bread flour. Just a plain flour. Just stop it from sticking. And then no fancy. Just needs a little bit more over there. No fancy kneading. No fancy forming into balls or anything like that. We are just going to. So as you can see there, you can see all that there. There's plenty of growth in that. We're just going to knock it back, knock all the excess air out of it. You can smell the dough as well, and it smells yeasty. Yeast smells a certain way, so it's like a bit of a brewery kind of smell, but it smells yeasty, so you know that the yeast is active. So you can smell it. Yeah, that certainly smells yeasty. Right, so this is the bit where they form it into fancy balls and tuck it under and all that kind of stuff. You don't need to. It's just a ball that we're going to form, and we're going to plonk it into the proving basket like that. Just let it move down a little bit, because you don't want it too close to. We're going to put the shower cap over the top of it, so we don't want it too close to the top, but we want a nice indentation like that. So pretty even. That's fine. And then flour on the top, in case it wants to, if you make a mistake and it wants to rise too much and touch the shower cap, and then shower cap on the top, just like that. Now it's getting quite late now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this. It's not going to prove and grow in size much more, because I'm going to put it in somewhere cool, and that's a good thing. You don't want it to rise like normal bread, because the majority of the rise in a sourdough loaf comes when you put it in the oven. So it's not important. Normally with bread, what you do is you let it prove, double in size, knock it back, prove it again, put it in the oven. It has a little bit of growth in the oven, and then it sets solid. A sourdough doesn't necessarily do that. It won't grow, it won't prove and grow a little bit more. All we're really doing now, it's called the second proof. I know I call it the second proof, but it's more just a case of what you're doing now is you are letting it ferment so you get a better flavour. So this now is going to sit in the fridge until morning. So it's what, about 12:30 at night now. So I'll be baking these about 8 o'clock in the morning. So it's going to sit in the fridge for 7.5 hours, 8 hours, something like that, depending on what time I get up. So I don't need to be up early tomorrow, and I might sleep in. So we'll see how we go, even though I've got lots to do afterwards. So I should really try and make myself get up early. So it's going to live in the fridge, or it'll live out in the garage or in the shed, just somewhere cool, just so it just ferments and just rises a little bit. But we'll see how much it rises in the morning, so you kind of get an idea. So that's that. That's going to live in the fridge, or outside, or in the garage for a few hours, which I would still do even if it was ready at 8 o'clock in the morning for the second proof, which is this stage. I would still put it in the fridge or keep it somewhere cool for a few hours before we baked it. So, because I don't want to talk about how we cook it in the morning, and I just want to wake up and turn the oven on, we'll talk about methods of how we're going to cook the bread. So, lots of people talk about cooking sourdough in a pot like this. These are expensive. Even if you buy the cheap ones, you're looking at quite an outlay. Although they work very well, and it's a good idea, and it holds the heat because they're cast iron. They are something that you might want to think about investing in the future. But as always, there is always a cheaper alternative. So what I use is, well, ignore the cast iron pot underneath. What I use is, well, we'll talk why I use the cast iron pot, but we'll talk about this. So this is an old frying pan that I've removed the handle from because it was a plastic handle, and this is an old wok which was getting past its best, and I took the handle off that, and this is what we're going to use to bake the bread in. That's going to be the bottom. I'm going to put that over the top. We're going to get it nice and hot in the oven, but that serves if you're just wanting to play around with sourdough and want it to be as cheap as possible to start off with, and then move up to things that are a little bit more expensive. This is a good way to do it. So it needs to be quite a heavy gauged frying pan. It doesn't want to be a cheap one, but it can be an old one that's fallen to bits that you no longer care about. By all means, go around the charity shops and find old frying pan, but it wants to be quite a thick one so it doesn't buckle when it's in the oven, because we're going to cook it at a very hot temperature. And what we do is we get the oven really hot, the hottest the oven will go, and then we put, these are already in the oven, heating up, and then we quickly put the dough in there, put the top on there, cook it for 20 minutes, then take the top off, and then we bake it on a lower temperature for a little bit longer. I'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow, but I just wanted to point out what I use to cook my sourdough. It always works this way. I haven't really used the what we call the Creuset-ish cast iron pot. I suppose I should do it in the future, but if something's not broke, there's no point fixing it. So this is a cast iron, parts of the world will call a skillet. This actually is a cast iron piler pan. It's cast iron, it's really heavy, and the purpose that I use this is that it stays hot in the oven. Ovens aren't particularly energy efficient. So what can happen is, as soon as you open the oven door, you lose all that heat. So by having something like this that's going to retain all that heat in it and have it in the oven's not going to cool down too quickly, and you want that hot temperature to start off with to kind of really give that bread that first burst of heat, which makes it come alive and cook and expand quickly. So that is a really good thing to have. If I didn't have that, what I would do is I'd have a couple of old house bricks that were nice and clean, and I'd have those in the fridge, not in the fridge, in the oven as it's heating up, and when they get hot they will stay hot, and when you open the door and all the air rushes out of the oven, they will stay hot, and then we'll get back up to a temperature really kind of quite quickly. So it's just a way of keeping the heat in the oven, is that. So that's it. until tomorrow. The next video will be me putting the bread into the oven rather than have to explain these bits, because I don't want to have to do it in the morning. I just want to be able to get up and cook the bread in. I've got another batch of bread to cook as well, so I don't really want to have to be faffing around too much explaining videos and then mucking them up and then having to start again and all that kind of stuff. So that's just a little bit of basics. It's just, this is a way that I use. It's just a cheap way of doing it. So they were kind of expensive, quite expensive when I bought them, but they got to the stage where they weren't useful anymore for what was going to they weren't useful for frying and stir frying anymore. However, they have now got a second life as my bread cloche that I use in the oven. So that's that. I don't think we need to explain anything else. The next video will be in the morning when I get up and I start cooking the bread. So the dough hasn't been in the fridge. It's been out in a cooler place in the conservatory overnight, where it's nice and cool. As you can see, so it'll be about 7.5 hours ago. So as you can see, there are some nice big air pockets wanting to push through to the top of the dough. So we know that it's been slowly proving and fermenting overnight. The oven's just getting up to temperature, so that's the next step. It's as high as it will go, and it's on fan as well. So it's going to be as hot as possible. You need to heat the oven up you can't just turn the oven on and put the bread in. The oven needs to be on for at least half an hour before you start baking, because you want it nice and hot and you want it to retain as much heat as possible to give it that burst of energy as soon as you put it into the oven. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn, that's going to become the bottom of the bread, so I'm going to turn it out onto the tray in the oven. You'll see, I'll move the camera so you can see. I'm going to turn it out onto the tray. We're going to do it as quickly as possible, and we're going to score the top of the bread. This is just a cheap craft knife. You can just use a razor blade. You can get a fancy tool that's specially designed for scoring the top of bread. But as always, that's, start cheap and work your way up to these things. It's like trying out a hobby. Just start doing it on a cheap way. If you enjoy it, you want to get into it more, you can progress your way up. You can buy better flours, you can buy better equipment. You can invest more time into it. You can practice and practice and practice, but to start off with, it might not be for you, bread breaking. It might be the worst thing ever, but you might want to give it a go. So you just got to do it on a cheap kind of way possible. So that's it for the moment. We'll stop the camera, we'll move the camera, and then it'll be time to put the bread in. But as you can see, it has moved because I sprinkled the flour on the top kind of quite uniformly. You can see that it has spread out in there, so it should be fine. We'll see how it goes. It is a brand spanking new starter, so I'm not entirely sure what it'll be like or what it'll taste nice, but it won't just be as nice as a bread made with a starter that's a little bit older than it is. Right, so we need to do this quickly. So pan out. Go in there. Sharp knife, run that across there. Lid on. And there we go. In the oven closed. 20 minutes on the highest heat that the oven will go. The idea of the bowl on top of the cooking pan is it traps the steam, and it's going to make the bread rise quite quickly. I have seen people spray a bit of water in there to create a crisp crust. I've never got that to work. That's probably something I need to work on. But I always just kind of think I'm quite happy with the way the bread turns out. So maybe I'll start doing that in future, or invest further into it and look into it. But that's it for 20 minutes. Timer set. And then we'll come and we'll remove the bread from the bread pan, and then we'll cook on a lower heat for another 20, 25, 30 minutes, something like that. So 20 minutes is up. Let's the big reveal. See how it is. Cloths, because it's going to be hot. Take the lid off. Moment of truth. Oh, there we go. That's risen quite a bit. So what we'll do is we'll put that in the oven. We'll move that up further up the oven so it keeps the heat in the oven. Turn it down to 180, and then we'll keep cooking that for another 20, 25, 30 minutes, something like that, so it goes nice and crispy. The bottom will sound hollow. I'll show you what it sounds like when it's ready. But this process now is just to set the crust. We've got lots of nice rise, and it's just to kind of get the outside crispy and to kind of cook it all the way through to make sure it's nice. But a success nonetheless. So that's it for half an hour, and then we'll come back and we'll finish off the video. Loaf is now ready. It had 25 minutes in the oven, so the crisp, it's got a nice solid crust on it. You can tell that it's ready because it sounds hollow when you tap on its bottom, like that. I don't know how well the microphone is going to pick that up, but that's how it should sound. So that'd be lovely. Let that go cold. You don't be tempted to slice into it now. Give it a good hour to cool down. It'll still be a little bit warm, and then you can cut into it. If you cut into it now, it'll just squish it. No matter how sharp your knife is, it'll just squish it to bits. I will let it cool down, and then we'll slice into it. Yeah, we'll slice into it. I'm also, while we're at it, I'm also baking some other bread as well, made with my old starter. So I've decided that I'll use the cast iron pot and have a go at cooking another batch of bread in the cast iron pot in the oven, which I'm doing at the moment, which heating up in the oven at the moment. So we'll have a look at how the one in the cast iron pot turns out as well. I think it's a little bit more complicated to put things in the cast iron pot to kind of drop it into the pot. I think that's why it won't put me off. Whereas the method that I use, you just put it onto almost like a flat tray, and then you put the lid on top. But anyway, that's it. We'll let that cool down, and then we'll have a look at the structure inside. But as you can see, it was probably half that size when I put it in the oven, and it's grown. The majority of the growth came in the oven, and then and it's got crispy. And then we'll cut into it. You can see it's got a nice split there, even though I cut there. I don't know why. But we'll cut into it when it's cooled down a little bit, and you can see the structure inside. But for all that, not having to form it into a fancy bowl and fold it and all that type of thing, pretty straightforward. Shall I talk about? No, I'll talk about the when I cut into it. We'll talk about I've got something else to talk about as well. But that's fine. That's it for an hour or so, and let that cool down. Let's have a look at the cast iron pot version of the sourdough. Give me some kind of idea if it works any better. Oh, that's impressive. That is impressive. So, oh, I can't get it out now. Aha! So, don't want to come out as easily, which is probably what put me off in the first place. Can we still see? Yes, we can. There you go. With the pot, you get the proper explosion of the bread like that. Let me just go in the oven quick before it drops. So, back in the oven. So, obviously because the pot's a little bit airtight, it keeps the steam in, and it makes it explode, and it gives you that explosion on the top, like you see with sourdoughs that you buy on fancy other videos. So that's worth bearing in mind. Although those cast iron pots are kind of quite expensive, I don't rush out and buy one. Have a go at making your own bread first, and then you want to move on to the next level. Certainly a cast iron pot is the way to go. Bread's cool enough to cut into. Let's have a quick cut into it, and then we can see what it's like on the inside. I don't know which way to cut it. Should we cut it that way or that way? We'll do this way. serrated knife is just that little bit easier with cutting bread like this. Nice crunch to it. Turn it around. But there you go. Nice, open, a little bit too open actually, if I'm honest. You're not going to get much butter on there, but as you can see, nice, without having to form it properly and do all those type of things, you get a nice open, what am I call it, lots of air pockets. Probably a little bit too, the yeast probably needs to calm down a little bit and needs to probably be a little bit older. I think my other loaves don't kind of do that, but it is like a fresh starter that I made this week. So, but still quite impressive, and nice big air pockets considering that you don't have to form it in any kind of fancy way. So if you want to have a go at sourdough, there you go. The easiest way that I can teach you how to make it. There we go. Oh yes, if you are going to cut, when you cut bread, cut it in half like that, and then you want to slice it along that way, like that. That means that you've just got it's just easiest to carve. If you try and do it that way, it's uneven like that. If you want to do it that way, what happens is you press down and you compact the bread, where if you do it that way, sliced that way, you'll get some nice slices of bread. I think that's all I had to talk about. I can't think there's anything else. I think that's it. No, I think that's it. There you go. A relatively easy sourdough, and do it that way. It'll give you some success, and it'll give you a little bit of confidence to try something a little bit harder, maybe invest in something a little bit more expensive, but there we go. We'll cut into, I've made 3 loaves today. This is one that I made with my older sourdough batch. So I've done, that's the new sourdough starter that I made. This is my one that's about a year old now. And then the one, obviously, I've got cooking in the oven, in the cast iron pot, that's from my old sourdough batch as well. So we'll cut into this one, and then we can have a look at that, and you can see kind of the difference in the starters. This one's just a little bit flatter. I don't know why. It's not an exact science, and I'm not good enough to kind of make them uniform all the same time, unfortunately. You get better, but I don't eat that much bread, and I tend to give most of it away as presents and things. So if I was making 2 or 3 a week, I'd certainly be a lot better than I am. So as you can see from my old starter, the air pockets aren't quite as big, a little bit more uniform, but as a sourdough goes, that's pretty good. So I think I'm not going to cut into the one that I've cut in the cast iron pot, because I've got to go out, and I've got to go and see my brother-in-law, and I'm going to take them that loaf of bread, or I might give that to my friend. I've got 2 loaves of bread to take out this afternoon. So, but this is one I'm going to keep for myself. I just need to decide which bread I'm going to give to which kind of person. But you can see this is the older sourdough starter. It's different. I'm not saying I'm unhappy with that one, but I just think those air pockets are a little bit too big, and I'm going to put that down to it being quite a new yeast, and it's probably a little bit too active is that yeast, whereas my older yeast culture, it's calmed down a little bit. But there's no difference in the way I made them. But anyway, that's kind of quite good. I think in the future I might cook in a cast iron pot. I've seen people, it might be a little bit easier to get it out with some paper in the bottom, but I'll have to think about that, and I'll make some more videos about bread. But this is the regular one that I make. But if I get that nice explosion on the top of the bed from the cast iron pot, I might carry on doing that, because it just kind of looks a little bit impressive, doesn't it? And people go, ooh, look at that. But anyway, that's from my older yeast culture. But they're all going to be nice tasting, you know. But that's it. I think that's it. I'm sure that's it. Yeah, there'll be more. I'll do a wholemeal one, and then I'll do some cheap flour sourdoughs, and you'll kind of see changes and difference and all.